Hello, I'm Dr. Roush, and I will be the instructor for History of Comics and Anime. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the content of the course, its themes, and why I think this is an important course. So the first issue to discuss is the content of the course. So the course is called History of Comics and Anime. Now, when I say comics here, I mean a couple different things, and I don't mean a couple other things. So first of all, I'm talking about American comics when I say comics. Sometimes these are now called graphic novels, but we'll be looking at the development of American comics, things like Superman, for instance. Now, we're not going to be focusing on newspaper comics. Sometimes we call newspaper comics comics. We will talk a little bit about newspaper comics in terms of their impact on comics, comic books, graphic novels, but we won't spend a lot of time on them for a couple reasons. One is simply that we've already got a lot of content to cover, and if we try to do newspaper comics, that would be a lot. I might mention some tangentially, but I'm not going to talk a whole lot about them, which is unfortunate because I love newspaper comics. I actually buy my children various books. I buy them Garfield books, for example. Get Fuzzy, I think is fantastic. Pearls Before Swine. I actually I have a print of a Garfield copy of a comic signed by Jim Davis in my office. So I really like comics in terms of newspaper comics, but we just don't have the time. And also, one problem is, alas, alack, newspaper comics are kind of a dying media in many ways. If you actually take the newspaper and read the comics, a lot of them are actually reprints of comics that were developed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They just keep reprinting them, which is unfortunate, instead of giving room to new creators. But I digress. By comics, I also mean manga. That is Japanese comic books. Now, a bit about pronunciation. Some people say manga. I'm fine if you want to say that. That's an acceptable pronunciation here in the United States. In Japanese, they would say manga. And I studied some Japanese. I'm just more comfortable saying manga. Whichever way you want to pronounce it in the United States is fine. If you're in Japan, it would be manga. But when I say comics, it includes both American graphic novels as well as Japanese manga. Right? If I try to say history of comics and manga and animation and anime, that would just be too much to get in a course title. So we will also be talking about American animation, maybe a little about European animation here and there, but the focus will be on the United States. And by this, I will usually refer to animation or cartoons. And we will also talk about Japanese animation or anime. Again, some people pronounce it in the United States anime. In Japanese, the A's are long, so it's an ah sound, so it's anime. Again, either pronunciation is fine. I just tend to go with anime. So that's the basic content. And the reason I call this History of Comics and Anime is I wanted to get in one American term and one Japanese term, right? I could have easily just called it the history of manga and animation or something like that. But the idea here is we're focusing on the United States. We're focusing on Japan. We're looking at American and Japanese comics and American and Japanese animation. Now, in terms of course themes, we're not just watching these things to enjoy them, though we should hopefully enjoy them at the same time as we're consuming them. We also have some themes. One of the big ones is, how are they all connected to each other? You could easily teach a course on just American comics or Japanese manga or American animation or anime. You could have a single course about all of them. And I have chosen to put them all together. Now, that means we can't go as much in depth, of course, right? If you're focusing on one subject versus 4 subjects, you can go more in depth, but we're not doing that. We're looking at multiple ones. And that was a conscious choice on my part because of the themes I wanted to explore. One particular issue that I want to explore is, how are they connected to each other? To give you an example from the United States, Jack Kirby, a very important early producer of comic books. He's famous because he drew the cover of Captain America punching out Hitler. Actually before the United States entered World War II, if I recall correctly. But he grew up learning to draw by tracing comic strips from the newspapers. He was inspired by pulp magazines. We'll talk more about those later. But his first real job as an artist was not in comic books, but was in animation. He works for the Fleischer Studios, which is famous for Felix the Cat and Coco the Clown, and we'll be looking a little bit at them later. But he started off basically in animation. But then when Fleischer Studios was run out of business by Disney, that's when he moved into comic books. So there's that connection. Similarly, of course, you can guess Walt Disney inspired a lot of very important Japanese artists. You can see his influence in people like Osamu Tezuka, in people like Miyazaki. So there's also this cross fertilization going on, these cross connections. So that's what we're going to be looking at. We're also going to try and understand the characteristics of these different art forms and how they changed and developed over time. That's what makes this a history class. In a large part, history is essentially the study of change over time. So we're going to be thinking about that. In particular, how do they shape and how are they shaped by the historical context in which they exist? So, for example, it's interesting that many, like I said, that Jack Kirby drew this image of Captain America punching Adolf Hitler in the face. It's important to note that a lot of the early comic book character creators in the United States were Jewish. And of course, you can bet they were definitely no friends to the Nazis, and in fact had their superheroes fighting Nazis before it was cool, before the United States was actually at war with them, which I think is interesting. So we also kind of ask this question, what then do comics and animation tell us about the people who produced them and consumed them and the times in which they lived? Right? This is what's kind of neat about popular culture. Popular culture, what does that term mean? Well, one definition of popular culture is it's culture that is self-sustaining by appealing to a mass audience. And by self-sustaining, I mean financially. So basically the idea is that if you can make a comic and people are willing to buy that comic, and that means the comic is able to continue, that means that that comic somehow connected with a sufficiently large group of people. And that comic, that connection tells us something about those people. And it tells us something about the times in which they lived. So in a sense, I think if you really want to understand a society, you should understand their popular culture. And this makes us a little bit different from other history classes, right? In another history class, we might be focusing on a king or a general or a president or a famous scientist. And that's good. We should totally do that. But that doesn't necessarily tell us a whole lot about how people lived their daily lives. But if we look at who people's heroes were, that tells us something. If we look at who people's villains are, that tells us something. It tells us a lot about how these people lived. One thing I think is fascinating is we will look at Snow White, very, very important, basically the first full feature animation. It was a movie, first animated movie, basically. And what I think is fascinating is how popular it was at the time, and how many times when I show it to students, how students just despise it. They don't like Snow White. So it's funny that this woman who was a heroine, people actually broke down crying when she died. Adults were crying in the movie theaters when she died in the movie. Now people just kind of despise her, which I think is fascinating. Or at least a large number of students I've had don't much like her. So that tells us something. This also, though, this issue of popular culture shows a tension that we will explore, the tension between art and profit. You know, if you're a animator or a film director or any kind of creative person, you typically face this issue where you want to make both the critics happy, you want respect from the critics, but you also want to make money, because if you don't make money, you can't survive as an artist, right? You'll have to do something else. And this is a tension. How do you make the art that you want to make? And how do you keep your fans happy? Because oftentimes there's a conflict between what the artist wants to do and what the fans want. And if you make the fans upset, they'll stop buying your comic. So there's always this kind of tension. You could see this with Walt Disney, who was more in many ways of an artist than a business person. He was lucky his brother had a good head for business. Osamu Tezuka, the creator of Astro Boy, used basically the money he made from making, in many ways, very crude animation for television in order to finance his creative animation. So there's this tension. And also we'll be trying to draw comparisons between these different genres and between these different countries. How are they similar? How are they different? And the idea is not to say which one is better. You could have your own personal opinion and say, well, I like this better. But they're doing different things, right? Different genres and different characters are doing different things for their audiences. And the idea is just to try and catch, okay, how are these things similar? How are they different? So why this course? Why do I teach this course? Well, the first reason is kind of personal. I teach about a lot of really depressing things. If you've taken classes with me before, you know this is what I do. For example, I teach a class on religion and warfare. Oftentimes that class is very depressing because we're talking about people killing each other. And unfortunately, history being what it is, the story of human experience, lots of people did lots of bad things to each other, and we have to talk about that. And it's just depressing. It really wears on me at times to keep talking about that. Don't get me wrong, I love history, but at times it's nice just to do something kind of fun. And you'll notice, and this I think causes a contrast, the comics I tend to like tend to be more aimed at kids. I enjoy those kinds of comics because they're often lighthearted. This comic is just funny. I mean, it's a little girl trying to feed a sheep, and she punches a sheep that steals the carrot of another sheep. Now, should you ever do this? No, of course not. But people have the good sense not to do it. And she's told clearly you shouldn't do this, but still, it's kind of funny, right? And that's sometimes what this stuff is. Comics, animation is oftentimes just an escape, self-abnegation, just an opportunity for us to kind of relax. And that's, for me, what I'm hope this class kind of is, a chance to kind of sit back and look at something that's maybe not so depressing as what I usually look at, and to give students a break from that in my classes. Now, one thing we have to stress is that you've heard the saying, you are what you eat. In a sense, you are what you consume. That's true not simply for food, but also for popular culture. I won't argue, and I've said this previously, but a lot of our values come from popular culture. And so it's important, I think, to think critically about what we're consuming, right? Because what you consume in terms of popular culture affects the way you think. It tells us something about you. If someone says, I like a particular group of musicians or a particular video game or anything like that, that tells us something about that person. And these comics, while often enjoyable, often have values that might not be clearly identified or that you have to kind of think about. And thinking about them tells us a lot about a particular society and also teaches us how to think critically about how we do it. So to give you an example, this is the comic Doraemon, which starts off, it just seems kind of a silly comic, right? Because Doraemon is this robot cat from the future. He has a little pouch in the front there that he can pull any invention out from the future. And what happened was the little boy pictured down on the left is little boy named Nobuto, and he grew up to be very irresponsible and spent all his money and his gained so many debts that his great children had to pay off those debts. So they bought a bargain discount robot cat. That's him. He's a discount because mice ate his ears off. So that's why they got him at a discount. They sent him back in time to teach Nobuto a lesson about how to be responsible. And each episode follows a kind of theme, or a kind of formula rather, where Nobuto has a problem. Doraemon pulls something out of his magic pouch that is meant to solve that problem through technology, and invariably it fails, and Nobuto learns a lesson about how you need to be responsible. This is something that's definitely teaching values. It's teaching people responsibility. It's saying things about science and technology. Science is hopeful and can seem to do a lot of things, but you still need to be moral. So even in something that's as gentle as cute as this, there are certain values that are being expressed, and you just want to think about that as you're consuming it. By the way, I also buy Doraemon comics for my kids because, again, I think they're cute and they're fun, and they also have good values. And I think this is one thing that helps make this course valuable, is that not only does it teach you how to think critically about what you consume, one day you'll probably have children, or you may already have children, or you will have nieces or nephews, or you'll have some dependent who is there that depends on you to help guide them in life. And it's good to steer them towards popular culture that has the kind of values that you want them to have, values that you think will help them lead a happy and moral life. So, for example, a lot of people complain about SpongeBob. And we're like, oh, SpongeBob is just toilet humor and it's really bad. And I'm like, have you ever watched SpongeBob? SpongeBob's all about friendship and doing the right thing, even when it's hard, especially the early episodes. And it's funny and silly enough that it will get the kids to watch it, but the lessons are always there. I mean, Squidward, the villain, is always punished. Plankton's always punished. when they do bad things, SpongeBob, as goofy and silly as he is, he usually wins in the end because he's good. And like I said, there's always these celebration of friendship. And so I buy my kids SpongeBob DVDs. They loved them. They're not as much into them now, I think, as they've gotten older. But the key thing here is this class will help you think about popular culture deeply and its development to understand, okay, this is the kind of good stuff that I want my children and others to be consuming. In terms of teaching this class, it's not, though, simply about values or children, and we're not just simply going to be looking at children's animation and manga. We're going to be looking at ones more for adult audiences or more mature audiences as well. And that's because they also can tell us, like I said earlier, something deeply about a culture. And what's important is a lot of times, like I said earlier, history is often the study of great people, powerful people. But that doesn't necessarily tell us about the common people, the everyday people. And what's cool about comics and animation and things like that are aimed at a popular audience, they tell us about that group of people. They can tell us something really fascinating about a particular group of people, about their fears, about their anxieties, about how they try and make sense of life. And so it's nice to have something that just sits outside the nation. So for example, if you look at the classes I teach, history of Japan, history of Korea, history of China, it focuses on national identity. And a lot of times, other classes, American history, 1920, 1945, American history, 1877 to the present, something like that. Oftentimes history is defined by the nation. And while that's important, what our citizenship, what our nationality is certainly important, as are other forms of identity. Human beings don't simply exist in that form, right? There's other aspects about us. And I think looking at how people entertain themselves, looking at how people think about themselves through popular culture is very valuable in understanding the human experience. Now, I chose these images here purposely because I think this is an example, right? Usually people don't take horror seriously. People look at horror, manga, and animation or something like that and don't take it seriously. And one thing I will point out, in this class, there will be some violent, scary, even some sexual things we'll look at. If you're not comfortable with that, I would highly encourage you to take a different class, right? We have to look at some things like that, or else I wouldn't be doing my job as an instructor. If you're especially sensitive, you may want to talk to me about that. But I do need to emphasize that horror is something that needs to be taken seriously, because horror often tells us what people's anxieties are. And we're going to be looking at some of Junji Ito's work. He's most famous for Uzumaki, which means spiral in Japanese. And it's this fascinating comic about how, or manga rather, graphic novel about how this town is being taken over by a shape, by spirals. And there's this fascinating chapter called Medusa, and it looks at the protagonist and how her hair and other women's hair starts to behave in this really strange way, making these spirals. And I'm not going to ruin it for you, but basically there's this tendency here to have a kind of body horror, right? Horror over our bodies doing things that we don't expect and acting in strange ways. And it makes sense that especially adolescents are going to be attracted to that kind of imagery, to that kind of story, and that tells us about their fears and concerns. So in this class, through things that normally you wouldn't think about as being important, about telling us about the human experience, I'm going to argue that they do. That things like horror manga do tell us what it's like to be Japanese, say, in the late 90s. Not simply in terms of, hey, this is my nation, we're going to look at the prime minister and all these things, but in terms of the average, everyday lived experience. So that's something I think that is interesting that I hope you'll get a lot out of in this class. But finally, to get something out of this class, you have to put something into it. I really have to stress. One thing that I think is really kind of frustrating when I talk about this class, I get one of two reactions. One reaction is, wow, that's really cool. That's the reaction I like. The other reaction is that a real class? And the answer is, yes, it is a real class. To understand comics and animation, you have to really study. You have to really think. This class will involve a lot of critical reading, critical writing, watching animation carefully, watching anime carefully, talking. You'll have to talk in this class or you'll get a really bad grade. It's very important to do those things. I have to stress. Some of this might be lighthearted. Looking at SpongeBob is certainly, humorous, but it is a serious class. It is a real class and it's a difficult class. right? It's not, hey, hey, we just got to read some comics. No, you have to read about comics and think about them, and you have to learn stuff. So I really have to stress, if you want to take this class just because it seems easy, you don't really care about comics, please drop this class because you're going to go nuts. On the other hand, if you're someone who's like, I really think this stuff is fascinating, I want to learn more, I'm ready to think critically, I'm ready to invest the time, I hope that this class will be rewarding for you. And I think it will be, because this stuff's so interesting, even I can't mess it up. So with all that being said, good luck, and I look forward to being with y'all as the semester progresses.